The land on which we are physically gathered today is unceded Indigenous land. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Nous honorons, respectons et reconnaissons ces nations qui n'ont jamais cédé leurs droits ni leur autorité souveraine sur ces terres et ces eaux. I'm Emily Saint-Hilaire, and welcome. Thanks for coming. We're going to have 4 speakers today, and Emanuele and I will moderate. We'll have some questions for our speakers. We'll hear from you all to answer any questions, and we'll be learning all about book publishing. So we are pleased to welcome our 4 guest speakers. 3 of our speakers are joining us via Zoom from all around the world. And we have 1 speaker with us here in the room as well. So I'll pass over to Emanuele to begin, and we'll hear from them now.
So how we're going to proceed is I'm going to introduce the first speaker, and then Chris, and maybe you want to take over and talk a little bit about your experience in book publishing and then we'll move on to the other introductions. Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Sounds great.
So Chris, I'll start with your introduction. Chris Salter is former Hexagram co-director and now professor for Immersive Arts and director of the Immersive Art Space at the Zurich University of the Arts. He's also professor emeritus in design and computation arts at Concordia University in Montreal and former co-director, like I mentioned, of Hexagram Network. Founder of the Milieu Institute at Concordia, he studied philosophy, economics, theater, and computer music at Emory and Stanford universities. His artistic work has been seen all over the world at such venues as the Venice Architecture Biennale, the Barbican Center, Berliner Festspiel, Wiener Festwochen, ZKM, Kunstfest, Weimar, Musée d'Art Contemporain, Exit Festival, and Place des Arts de Montréal, among others. He is the author of Entangled, Technology and the Transformation of Performance, published in 2010, Alien Agency, Experimental Encounters with Art in the Making in 2015, and recently Sensing Machines 2020 from MIT Press. Thank you for being with us, Chris. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Manuel, and everybody in my former stomping grounds of Quebec. I miss everybody. Here it's already cold, to 10 degrees or something, but in Zurich, I would just get back from Greece where it was very warm. So I'm glad everything has been, everyone's gathered together. We did a similar kind of workshop actually many years ago at Hexagram with Doug Seri, who was the former editor at MIT Press of New Media and HCI, of which now Noah is the editor of. And that was very interesting. And so I'm glad to see that there was a follow-up on this, since publishing books are still important, even though we tend to live in a world where we're reading them on our phones, like I do. Or I write books on my phone as well. But I guess what I can do is share a little bit of my personal experience writing. As some of you know, I don't know how many there in the audience. I know some clearly. I have a kind of a weird background because I'm, as a lot of people say, oh, you're an artist who writes books. You know, that's such a strange thing. Like, artists don't write books; they make artworks. Well, one of the reasons that I write, and I write books, is I actually want to work an argument or an idea over in a detailed way over a long number of, over a long period of time and over a long number of pages, which is really different than an artistic work where you have an event and you experience that work, and it works at many different levels. But it's different than an argument. It's different than a carefully researched or carefully thought through long-term way of trying to put something forward. And I guess I say from a personal standpoint, I I'd been trained both as an artist, but also as an academic in universities. So I learned really early on, actually already in high school, to write fast and well. But I think what's interesting is that when I first actually when I finished my PhD in 1997 at Stanford, and I stayed outside of the university for almost 10 years, working professionally in the arts and also working professionally in Silicon Valley, and worked as a producer in multimedia audio. And so I did not have a similar trajectory as many people do, where they finish a dissertation, get a PhD, or then they become potentially a tenure track faculty member, and then they publish their PhD, their dissertation as their first book. I didn't do that at all. My dissertation was actually a very weird document that I'm glad no one published. It was too strange. It was a kind of manifesto, which actually very much influenced the second book I did, Alien Agency, but many years later. And I think one of the reasons I was excited to write my first book, which was Entangled from 2010. In fact, I signed the contract with MIT Press before I became a professor at Concordia. So I was actually an independent artist when I signed that contract. And then I got the job in Canada. I was teaching at the Rhode Island School of Design as a visiting professor. And one of the faculty members at Brown University, next to RISD in Providence, Todd Winkler, who had written one of the first books on the software Max, composing about interactive music. I had given a talk there and at this symposium at Brown about the use of video in performance, and he was very interested and said, "Oh, no one knows this history. This is really interesting history. You should write a book about this." And I said, "Well, that's interesting because I've thought about these questions a long time. How technology has been integrated in theater and dance and music and the visual arts and the media arts and sound." And I knew that I kind of knew the literature, even though I wasn't really deeply in academia at the time. And he said, "Oh, you should go meet, Doug Sari at MIT because, he has this big new media series." And I said, "Yeah, I've been working at the time in new media practice for about 10 years." And I said, "Yeah, there are no books on performance and technology in that context." So I went to MIT and I talked to Doug and I said, you're trying to set the ground on what new media is, but the new media reader had come out. There was a lot of the language of new media from Manovich, so there was really a field growing, And I said, "Yeah, but performance is not part of that." And he says, "Yeah, you should write that book so to contribute to it." And so I think I was really excited since I'd done years of research on these subjects, both from an artistic standpoint, but also from a scholarly standpoint, to try to write that. And I guess my first advice to everyone is what's important is when you want to write a book or you want to make a proposal is that you have something to say, and that other people have said it, but maybe they haven't said it the way you want to say it. And I think that's really important because now we're so bombarded by so much information all the time. I mean, it's hard to read a long book now. In fact, I wrote crazy enough. Entangled was a very, very long book because it was kind of encyclopedic, trying to put together a whole kind of set of histories, almost like the way you surf the internet. Some histories are really short, some are much longer. But I think this important thing is that you have something to say and you have a passion of how you want to say it. And you also, you have a perspective, you have a unique perspective on the subject. So when someone opens the book and they start reading it, they say, okay, you get immersed immediately in that, in the writer's world. And you feel that the writer really has done their homework and really wants to communicate something to you, through their ideas and their passion and also the kind of depth of work they've done. So I think the really interesting thing, about books and still, as I said, they're different than other things. Watching a Twitter feed or watching a YouTube video, is that they really engage you in a whole world. They take you through different kinds of spaces and different kinds of ways of expressing things. And they let you work out the complexities of things that might not at first be apparent to you. And especially everyone's dealing with Hexagram with technology and its entanglement with culture. And how, when you're dealing with that, you have to deal with aesthetic, political, social, economic, ecological concerns all at the same time. And writing is a way of doing that, is a way of working through the complexities of now our lives around issues that are really of importance to us, but allowing us to work at a detailed level, to work at showing what people have done, showing why there are holes in what's been done and why that is. That's what we classically call a literature survey. And then also, telling story. I mean, that's really what good books are. They're strong stories, and you're motivated to read those stories. And of course, there's lots of critiques of academic writing that it's very insular and that it's meant only for peers. But I think even when you're writing for peers, you're writing for an audience who's intelligent, who knows what you're talking about, but they're looking for your spin on it, your way of looking at it. So I think that's really the kind of key thing in writing is it's a chance to work in a different way than you and a level of depth and complexity and also a level of communication with others that you might not be possible that within this, either a short essay or even, as I said, in an artistic work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris.
That's a great start. Thanks, Chris. We'll turn now to Noah J. Springer. And Noah is the acquiring editor for New Media, Digital Humanities, Game Studies, HCI, and Design at the MIT Press. He is interested in expanding these fields for general audiences and diversifying the authorship for this list. He also manages the New Radium Age book series and is interested in republishing forgotten science fiction classics. Noah holds a PhD in media studies from the University of Colorado Boulder, and you can follow him on Twitter at Noah J. Springer. I'll turn to you, Noah.
Yeah, thanks. Chris has done a great job that I feel like I will have trouble following up on, describing the rationale for still writing books in the 21st century. I would agree with almost everything you said. Especially in terms of, people predicted the death of the book for a long time, and it is still here and we're still publishing. I wouldn't quite say we're recession proof, but we do seem to be resilient, at least. And so I want to talk a little bit kind of more on the ground of what actually the book publishing process is like. When I was in grad school, I did a couple edited collections, and it was really a black box. We sent off the manuscripts. Several months later, I got some pages back with some notes. We did some edits, sent it off again. Miraculously, a book landed in my mailbox about 6 months later. And so one of the things that I like to do is talk about the actual process itself and what's kind of happening behind the scenes. And I'm not going to be able to get to too much today, but I do want to talk about things like, when you send in a proposal, there's kind of a detailed, maybe not detailed, but a complex process that the editor is going to go through, kind of deciding whether or not that the right fit for the press. And fit is really the kind of key word that editors are thinking about. When Chris was talking about approaching my predecessor, Doug, he had something that was a great fit for this list. Something that's in new media, it's in the field of talking about where the field is out and pushing it further and pushing on the boundaries. And so sometimes a proposal will really let the editor know whether or not this is going to be a good fit. And just because you're not the right fit for the press doesn't mean the book's not a good idea, that there's not a reason to write the book, but it just might be there might be a book in the pipeline that the editor already has that's too close in content to this book. There might be the editor might feel that it's not pushing that boundary enough, but it might be pushing a different boundary for a different press. So, I focus on new media stuff, but often my list has more of a tech bent. If you're more on the philosophy side of things, you might be looking at Duke. That might be the right fit. If you have a little more popular culture angle, you might be looking at NYU. So really, it's about thinking about where the right fit is, and the editor is going to spend a lot of time looking at a proposal, looking at things like what your competition is. Your comps are incredibly important for the editor to understand where you view your book. They're going to look up how many copies that book has sold, and that tells you something or other. But they might also be looking up, citations, and what impact this would have, because sales, especially for university presses, are not everything. It is a factor, especially if you are trying to reach that general audience. We are looking for something that's going to have some sort of significant sales. But in general, we're looking for something greater impact. And so we want fit and impact are really important factors into how an editor is considering whether or not this would be a good fit. And another thing to really think about as you're preparing a proposal is the audience. Not every book has a general audience. A lot of people really like to say, oh, this is going to be picked up for people who write the New York Times. That's really the broadest fit you could get. To be specific and clear about what the audience for your book is can be really important. And even if I publish books that are for game study professors, and that's that's probably about 300 people, 400 people, but that's an audience that we publish for specifically, and that we're the leaders in the field. So I really do want to publish, even if you're only talking to professors in game studies. I want to publish that book if it is on the leading edge of the field and if that's where you're pushing boundaries. And so really being specific about that audience, even if it's not the largest audience, we're still looking for specific audiences as well. And that's something that university press will give you, that a trade press, something like, Penguin Random House or, Hachette wouldn't necessarily. They are looking for that huge audience, and they are not going to be publishing these kind of small niche books that are critical to pushing a field forward and keeping that robust literature in print is another aspect of it. Mm-hmm. And so if you are looking to draft a proposal, you can always approach the editor for the list that you think is right. If you go to the University of Chicago Press or whatever press you think is a great way of choosing a press is look at your literature that you're citing in your book. Look at what's on your bookshelf. That's what it. Just go to your bookshelf and look at the colophons, the logos on the spines, and see books you love that you think are your good comps are being published. And check out their website. Try and find the right editor that you think is thing, and shoot them an email and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about this book. Do you think that's the right fit?" They might say no. They might suggest you try a different press, but they might say yes and direct you to some proposal guidelines. You draft that up. Send the proposal. Generally includes a couple sample chapters. It's really important to get a sense of the tone. And generally, people do also send in full manuscripts. That is fine if you have a full manuscript. We'll consider that as well. But I do like to see a proposal, just because there are certain things in that kind of prospectus where you're talking about comps, you're talking about audience that I don't necessarily get from just the manuscript itself. That helps me see how you are envisioning kind of the meta of the manuscript, not just the content itself. So that's helpful. We'll then send that proposal out for peer review. 3 people get that reviewed. We've also been experimenting with open review at the press. I don't know how much time I'll have to chat about that, but we can talk about the open peer review process we have. Our peer reviews, we try to get 3 reviewers. This differs from press to press at, proposal time. Sometimes I've had the manuscript out for 4 months and the third reviewer bails and I only have 2 reviews. And what are you going to do? I kind of move forward with that if I can. And then I also try to get it reviewed at the manuscript stage if I haven't reviewed once of the proposal, to have as many people getting eyes on theirs who are really experts in the field. And that's I'm approaching people within my network, but also I'm going out and exploring new options to try and expand those networks at large. So the peer review process really is a critical part to the kind of university press book publishing process. Then let's say,
sorry, Noah, maybe we get a chance to elaborate on the different points further along, just so that we go
sure.
round table.
Yeah, no, please. Yes.
Sorry for interrupting you, but we're going to have questions about those specific processes further along, and maybe you can elaborate on those as we move on.
Yes, please.
With the specific questions that will come in the second part.
Okay, that sounds great.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much, Noah. So let's meet Meredith Carruthers, who's here in the room. Meredith is a member of the Montreal-based artist duo Leisure, who are current PhD students in the Indie program, Faculty of Fine Arts, Concordia University. Carruthers is the managing and production editor at Concordia University Press, where she is part of the editorial group for the series Building Arguments, a co-publication series with the Canadian Centre for Architecture. And she has written on display and exhibition making for Abitare, Cura.art, and Canadian Architect. Her text, Some Other Systems of Orientation, Publishing Exhibitions, was included in As Seen, Exhibitions That Made Architecture and Design History with Yale University Press. She was a visiting faculty advisor for the experimental course Publication Incubator at SAIC, and she was associate curator of the 2014 Istanbul Biennial, where she was co-editor of the catalog The Future Is Not What It Used to Be. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here in person. I think when I look forward, I see real people, and I think I make eye contact with digital people, but I'm not sure. So if I'm looking all over the place, it's because I see faces over here. But I'm happy to be following up just after Noah. I'm going to speak more about my role at Concordia University Press, which is primarily managing editorial, and I manage also production for the press. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm a bit quiet.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll speak a little bit about Concordia University Press. We're a very new university press, so glad to hear the news from Noah that people are still reading books, especially as we're in year 3 of producing books at Concordia. Concordia University Press started in 2016. That's really where the kind of more general structure was put into place, and it became its own arm's length, not-for-profit. The very first books from Concordia Press came out in 2020. So we had one publication in 2020, following up to double that 2021 with two books. And in 2022, we'll have a total of six publications. It's a very small team. So we have a full-time acquisitions editor, we have our director, and then myself working on the production side. And Concordia University Press produces print volumes, but we're also open access. Because we're a new press, we have this amazing opportunity to begin our journey as a full open access publishing platform. We are based in Concordia University Library, where open access is a huge priority. So all titles at Concordia University Press at the moment are hosted on Manifold, which is an EPUB platform through Minnesota. It's an exciting platform because it allows for enriched media, video, audio. It also can do some interesting things in terms of iterative writing, which could be interesting for research creation practitioners. I brought some samples of our books, and I'll talk a little bit about how we've been approaching design. Design at Concordia University Press is, by its nature, much more bespoke than you might see at a larger press like MIT, partly because we are, setting up a lot of our templates and series and individual publications. So for me, coming from more of an architecture, design, art background, I was more familiar with artist publications or design forward publications. So one of the first surprises for me was in scholarly publishing, which is such a long form medium, how much is actually templated. So I'll pass around one of our books where we've been testing out a platform. So in the case of a book like this, that's slightly more traditional, we worked with one typesetter on our book block, another designer with the cover. So Sébastien Aubin is part of an Indigenous design collective here in Montreal, and he worked on the cover. This is a proof version, so you'll see it doesn't have its coding. It's a beauty. Sorry that you can't see it on the screen. And then the book block is designed by Garrett Markwart, who is based in London, Ontario, and it really privileges like a long form reading experience with serif typefaces, very legible, and illustrations throughout. We took quite a different approach with a recent book. This is called Engage for Public Scholarship. This is Alex Ketchum, who's a scholar based here in Montreal. This is a book that's really around feminist accessibility. And we felt like as a press, it was also interesting to address what is accessibility for the reading of this book. So this is a book where it's designed as a whole object. It's not a cover and then an interior. The entire thing was considered as a handbook. So we made some different choices in terms of paper. It's a very lightweight, inexpensive printing. We printed locally for this volume with Gauvin, they're in Gatineau. And it's a much larger typeface. We worked a lot with headings and subheadings just to make wayfinding throughout the volume really accessible and useful. So far the feedback has been very positive. We worked with Low Key Design, Kevin Lowe, who's quite well known here in Montreal as an activist designer who works with a lot of not-for-profits on various levels. We've been trying to work as much as possible with Canadian designers. So I think that will kind of come up over and over. We also have a series of books that's artist writings, which we're bringing out our third volume in that series shortly. It's on press right now in Manitoba. So the most recent one to coming out next month, fingers crossed, is the collected writings of Liz Magor. The first was the collected writings of Ken Lem. This is another kind of bespoke project. So with the first book, we worked with Infoco, which is a female-owned business. They're based in Los Angeles, but Shannon Harvey, one of their principals, is Canadian. And we worked really to understand, like, what does artist writings need from a design perspective? And their proposal was to come up with this kit of parts that really addressed each form of writing. So one layout, one grid, it's for letters, one layout's for emails, one layout's for dialogues, and then we also have original documents we integrated throughout. So it's a chronological approach, but each layout is a little bit different. We used, again, the same kit for Colin Campbell, which was a completely different book because it really used more like video scripts and diary notes. So it's kind of interesting to think about like how all these multiple things can make up a different kind of whole. You can pass that one around. This is a very tiny publication. This is part of the series that we're working on with Canadian Centre for Architecture. And it's a pamphlet series, very short, architects on one topic. These are all then, coming out of the archives of CCA, contextualized by a scholar, and then come together in these little pamphlets. They're beautiful. So you can see when I pass it around, the designer is Sean Yendris. He is, actually has a Concordia relationship. He trained at Concordia, but he's now head of the design school in Estonia. His concept was for the whole series that each one would have a different color, interior pages, and cover. So it's really like a little chunk of paper. These ones are being printed in Leipzig at Posdruck, which we're very grateful for the support of the Graham Foundation to be able to have our colored paper. Yeah, it's a little bit different. So that's kind of a whirlwind of approaches that we're taking with the design of the books. And I'm happy to touch more on timelines, sort of picking up from where Noah left off. We also have a similar timeline in terms of peer review. After the peer review has been positive, or if there are revisions, the manuscript gets worked again through acquisitions. And then when the manuscript is complete, it comes into my departments, which is just me. And we do the editorial work, which we work with contracted editors, and then we'll start to work through what kind of budget we have for the design, what the expectations of the author are, what our expectations are. And from the moment of getting the final manuscript to holding a book in your hands, for us, it's about a year. And that includes all of the proofing and a bit of a buffer at this point for printing As we're experiencing a lot of paper shortages, we're finding that our press times are getting a little bit longer. And our workflow through the open access, we work from the same designed document, and then we split to print and to digital. So I think other places are starting to get more experimental with that workflow, going all digital one way, but we're still going through a proof process that follows a traditional print model. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. And we are going to switch to French with Emanuele Quinz, who I have the pleasure to introduce. En français, donc Emanuele Quinz est un historien de l'art et du design. Il vit et il travaille à Paris. Il est professeur associé à l'Université de Paris 8 et chercheur associé à l'EnsAD, École nationale supérieure des arts déco. Il a notamment publié Le cercle invisible, environnement, système, dispositif, avec Mimesis en 2014 et Presse du réel en 2015. Strange Design, coédité avec Dautré, publié à Été Édition en 2014. Uchronia avec Annie Vigier, Frank Appertet et par Sternberg Press en 2017. Et récemment, Contro l'oggetto, Conversazione sul design, qui lui a valu le prix Compasso d'Oro 2022. Félicitations, Emmanuel, pour cette reconnaissance. Et Le comportement des choses, édité aux Presses du réel en 2021. Il a fondé et co-dirigé les séries d'édition Media Theory et Design Theories aux éditions Les Presses du réel également. Merci d'être avec nous, Emanuele. Je vais te passer la parole.
Merci beaucoup à tout le monde pour cette invitation. Je suis très honoré d'être après ces très belle présentation. Donc, je vais pas forcément revenir sur mes expériences, mais je me suis dit que j'avais envie de parler des 3 points en particulier. Et je voulais commencer par les choix de l'éditeur. Donc là, on a pas mal discuté jusque maintenant des éditeurs universitaires, mais c'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, on a un panel large, un horizon très, très large d'éditeurs indépendants qui ont parfois des projets extrêmement intéressants. Et donc, je pense que au moment où on publie un livre, c'est important de se poser la question, comme on l'a dit tout à l'heure, de quel est le public, mais aussi de choisir un éditeur, non seulement par opportunité, mais aussi par vraiment en faisant un choix stratégique. Donc, je pense qu'il y a plusieurs critères qui peuvent nous guider dans ces choix de l'éditeur, donc un éditeur qui peut être académique ou indépendant, qui sont d'un côté l'idée d'un positionnement disciplinaire. Est-ce qu'il est plutôt art, plutôt design, plutôt architecture, s'il s'adresse, donc à quel public il s'adresse, donc un public plutôt, comme on l'a vu tout à l'heure, universitaire, ou plutôt un grand public plus large, évidemment, bien en regardant quelles sont les chaînes de diffusion de cet éditeur. Et ensuite, pourquoi pas aussi voir quels sont les formats que cet éditeur privilégie. Donc, par exemple, si il s'engage sur de l'expérimentation graphique ou même si on peut collaborer sur des projets, même au-delà de la publication, donc vraiment de penser l'éditeur aussi comme un sujet et acteur, collaborateur du projet de recherche. Ou encore, évidemment, très important, un positionnement culturel, parce que souvent il y a des maisons d'édition qui défendent de certains projets, les projets par exemple de défendre un domaine disciplinaire spécifique, ou encore un positionnement qui peut être aussi politique ou idéologique assez fort. Par exemple, il y a beaucoup d'éditeurs aujourd'hui extrêmement engagés sur les problématiques sociales ou sur des approches décoloniales, féministes, etc. Donc, il me semble que voilà, l'éditeur, c'est pas juste une plateforme pour publier des contenus, mais c'est aussi, comment dire, un allié, un complice qui peut être extrêmement important. Souvent, d'ailleurs, les petits éditeurs qui ont peut-être des tirages et des diffusions assez petites sont souvent une personne, mais ils peuvent apporter des projets effectivement extrêmement ambitieux du point de vue culturel et donc comment dire, ça peut devenir véritablement une forme de coopération et de coordination et qui est extrêmement intéressante. Bien évidemment, les petits éditeurs n'ont pas du tout les mêmes ressources que les grands éditeurs, hein, donc parfois on a besoin d'arriver avec aussi des petites ressources, mais les dialogues peuvent être extrêmement intéressants et passionnants. Autre question très, très importante, c'est la question de la langue. Bien évidemment, publier en anglais ou en italien, ce n'est pas du tout la même chose. Donc là aussi, il faut bien réfléchir à quel impact on veut avoir et aussi qu'est-ce qu'on défend. Donc, par rapport aussi à cette question-là. Le deuxième point qui est extrêmement important pour moi. Alors, on me reproche souvent de faire beaucoup de livres collectifs. Pas assez de monographies, mais c'est vrai que j'aime en fait les livres collectifs. C'est vraiment une forme d'écriture polyphonique, dialogique, qui me semble vraiment participer d'une démarche de recherche. Donc on réunit autour d'une thématique, d'une problématique, une polyphonie des voix. Donc ce qui est très important au moment où on dirige finalement un ouvrage collectif, c'est de pas forcément d'imposer une idée, mais de fonctionner un peu comme un curateur, un commissaire d'exposition, donc qui pose des voix différentes et qui, pourquoi pas, il garde une tension aussi entre ces voix. Donc, il me semble important de garder justement cette tension tout en essayant d'avoir la même forme d'exigence, à la fois formelle et des références. Malheureusement, même au niveau universitaire, les travail sur les références est assez, pas assez exigeant, je trouve. Donc, il y a un vrai travail à faire dans cette direction. Il y a aussi à l'intérieur de livres collectifs, il y a des temporalités qui peuvent être très très différentes. Donc, Chris, il disait tout à l'heure que ce qui lui plaisait, c'est dans l'écriture, c'est aussi de travailler sur quelque chose qui s'articule sur un temps lent et donc qui permet finalement un approfondissement, mais on peut aussi travailler moi je l'ai fait sur un livre que j'ai fait avec l'éditeur Sternberg, travailler sur des protocoles très serrés, donc un peu comme une œuvre conceptuelle dans laquelle on fait une proposition à des auteurs sur un temps très très court et voilà, donc là il y a très peu de travail de réécriture qui est fait et donc on présente un peu comme un livre qui ferait Hans-Ulrich Obrist, quelque chose comme ça. Donc, une série d'éléments comme des documents qui témoignent finalement d'un processus d'interaction. Et ça peut être aussi une démarche extrêmement intéressante où le livre n'est pas la fin d'un processus, d'une pensée, mais le début d'un processus d'échange et d'interaction. Et je termine avec le dernier point qui est aussi extrêmement important pour moi, qui est la question des traductions. Alors moi, je suis né en Italie, dans une zone de l'Italie où on parle allemand. Donc, j'ai grandi vraiment dans cette question de frontières et des multilinguismes qui est extrêmement important et que vous vivez absolument d'une manière aussi très forte au Québec, au Canada en général. Et donc, cette question de la traduction, il me semble extrêmement importante. On traduit peu en français, on traduit encore moins en anglais. Et donc, il me semble que là, encore une fois, c'est une opportunité fondamentale pour produire une forme de pluralité de références, pour décentrer les perspectives et aussi donc permettre à d'autres voix d'émerger. Les traductions, c'est quelque chose d'assez complexe. C'est un travail très, très, là, du coup, assez long. Effectivement, par exemple, venu d'Italie ici en France, je me suis rendu compte que dans certains domaines, manquait des textes fondamentaux. Et donc, c'est pour ça que, avec d'autres collègues, principalement italiens, tous disons, parlant plusieurs langues, nous avons décidé donc de lancer une collection qui s'appelle Media Theory d'abord et une deuxième qui s'appelle donc Design Theory, où avec l'objectif vraiment de éditer en français, qui n'est pas notre langue principale, mais c'est disons le contexte dans lequel nous travaillons. Et donc de publier des textes fondamentaux. Donc, par exemple, avec la collection Design, nous avons républié les textes fondamentaux de Victor Papanek, Design for the Real World, qui avait été publié dans les années 70. Il avait été épuisé et nous avons fait avec Alison Clark de la Fondation Papanek de l'Angewandte de Vienne, donc une édition critique. C'est la première qui est sortie donc, et qui est publiée donc en français. Et là, on travaille actuellement sur les écrits d'auteurs absolument fondamentaux comme Thomas Maldonado, Enzo Mari, Ettore Sottsass et d'autres. Et pour les médias aussi, donc nous avons fait tout ce travail. Donc c'est vraiment quelque chose de très 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 important. Et comme je disais, donc ça permet effectivement de garder cette idée du territoire qui se pluralise, dans lesquels on rentre en dialogue avec des cultures différentes, et ça permet aussi de déstabiliser des terrains disciplinaires, des champs et des domaines disciplinaires. Et ça me semble extrêmement important. Et je voudrais vraiment terminer sur ces mots de déstabiliser, parce que je pense que le but des ouvrages, enfin des livres qu'on publie, c'est pas forcément de consolider une carrière, un domaine, une discipline, mais on l'a déjà dit, c'est de pousser les limites de discipline, et c'est fortement vraiment cette idée de déstabiliser nous quand nous sommes en train d'écrire et les autres quand nous sommes en train de nous lire.
Merci Emanuele. On va élaborer sur plusieurs points sur lesquels tu as touché.
Avec plaisir.
As we've heard from one another, I just wanted to give an opportunity to the speakers to add anything that came to mind as you were listening to one another, or any other points that you'd like to add just now before we move to further questions for you. Sorry, you're on mute, Chris.
I know. I just noticed. I actually will back up Emanuele as the question about translation. And of course, this applies for those who don't necessarily write in English. It's an extremely important issue. And even though you might think that, there's, first of all, you have to hire a professional translator. You can't hire someone who's a friend. You have to hire someone who really knows how to, because translation is an art. My wife is a translator, she translates literature into German. So I know a lot about translation from her. And translation is not literal translation of the words in a text into another language. It's finding a way in which that language you're translating into, it can express those ideas in its form. So if you're writing, for instance, in French or another language, and you want to pitch a book to a publisher, there are, especially in Canada and also in Europe, there are many sources of funding to translate, to get things translated, to pay for professional translators to do it. And I definitely would encourage people to, if you're not writing in English, not to feel that you can't approach, for instance, an English press, because it's necessary certainly to bring things from foreign languages into English. But it's very necessary to find a professional translator who can really do service, because you can do great disservice to a work by having it poorly translated. And I've read books actually for MIT and other presses that were not very good translations, which are reviewed books, and it makes it very, very difficult to, when you know the original and then you read the translation, you say, my God, this is really a disaster. So it's something really to not take lightly, but also to be encouraging in the sense of, yes, books that are written in other languages, and you want to translate them into English, to approach English speaking presses is something to look into, but to be aware of the fact that it's really like writing another book in many ways.
Mm-hmm. We can start. We've prepared a number of questions, like Emily was saying, we've prepared a number of questions. Your audience here today, maybe you don't see properly, but it's a number of students, both from UQAM. We have a few from Concordia. And so the idea for this second, part was to address this number of questions that we've previously sent to you in quite pragmatic ways, so that the audience here of students, and I think a few researchers, discuss and reflect on these very pragmatic steps of elaborating a book proposal to what to expect from the process. So I'll let you.
Sure. A couple other questions we had, and then we'll open it up to the room. But one thing that might be new for young scholars is the review and editing process. So anyone who would like to speak to that process, for example, how to respond to reviewers, how to feel about that process, and because I think that reviews require a response from the author. So maybe just to clarify a little bit what that experience is like for our audience. Thanks.
Who was going to address?
Oh, anyone who would like to, really? Anyone who
Noah should definitely speak to that, because
I can start off. Yeah, so we do require responses to the reviews, and generally there's some solid guidelines out there for how to approach it. My general rule of thumb is be responsive to specifics. Generally, have both a kind of general outline of how you're going to adjust the final manuscript from the proposal, or the final round of edits from the manuscript as it stands, and then also address the specific concerns. But also, don't be afraid to push back if you disagree, especially if you have a reason. Don't push back just like, I don't want to do that. But if there's a point, oftentimes reviewers will come in and they want a different book than actually what is being made. And so if you find one of the reviewers says, oh, well, I think the author should do X, Y, and Z, and you say, well, that's not really what I think the book should be doing and where I'm going with my argument and what's happening, don't be afraid to kind of push back on that. A good editor will respect kind of the boundaries that you want to set on your own book, because not every book can do anything. But at the same point, when the criticism is valid, and expect to make changes and expect to do some additional work kind of based on the reviews. And the editor should help guide you. Don't be afraid to say, hey, what do you think? In general, when I send the reviews back to an author, I will send kind of a set of kind of meta comments of the trends because there's 3 reviews. I'll see 2 reviewers pointed this out, 3 reviewers pointed this out, only 1 pointed this out, and so I'll try and highlight the things that I find most important to give you a kind of a sense of where I think we should kind of take the text. And sometimes it's fairly drastic in terms of what we expect. Trying to move the whole, especially at the proposal stage. Like, I'm just working with a project right now where I'm really trying to get a larger form of argument and narrative to be built into the structure of the book, as opposed to before it was kind of profiles of people. And I really think that there's a large audience for this book, so I think having argument and a narrative built into there is important. So I've been working with the author about how to kind of address this criticism, which also arose in the reviews of the book. And so we've been talking together, and a good editor will work together with you to make sure that you're both doing what you want to do. Nobody wants you to write a book you don't want to write, but also make it the best book as possible. I live in service of the book, and so the reviews, what I'm hoping to see is that you are also doing what's best for the book and best for what's happening based on kind of the reviewer feedback, if that makes sense.
Emanuele, do you have a comment on the...
Non, je pense que ce que vous avez dit, c'est tout à fait, c'est absolument très précis. Je pense que effectivement, il y a quand même deux extrêmes. Donc, d'un côté, effectivement, quand on travaille avec les éditeurs indépendants, souvent, il n'y a pas du tout de review. Donc, c'est vraiment l'éditeur qui choisit les livres. Donc, finalement, ça peut aussi poser les risques que finalement des erreurs passent, parce que ce qui est très important aussi dans le travail de l'éditeur, c'est que l'éditeur doit aussi veiller qu'il n'y ait pas des erreurs dans les livres, des erreurs factuelles, parce que même les chercheurs, ils peuvent en faire. Et donc, ça, là aussi, on voit vraiment une différence entre entre les bons éditeurs et les éditeurs qui publient juste des livres, quoi. Et ça, effectivement, la review est un élément extrêmement important, mais parfois on peut aussi tomber sur des reviewers qui sont très mauvais, hein, donc c'est ce qui peut arriver. Donc voilà, souvent il faut vraiment passer par plusieurs processus pour être assez certain que les choses aboutissent.
I would just also kind of second a little bit what Noah was saying, and my experience is that like good editors are not going to try to sabotage the book. So in other words, you know, this is why it's important in your proposal to really kind of state who you might think should review the book, and also how do you position the field. So, because the editor is not going to send it to someone who may be against what you're, you know, the style, for instance, you want to write the book in, or the topic you want to write the book about. So it's important to kind of position in the proposal, like really where the space is, especially that's really important in interdisciplinary work where no one person, or it's rare one person can be able to review areas of knowledge that, you know, may not be, you know, across 2 or 3 fields of knowledge. That's very difficult for many people. And if you're writing that kind of book and you have that knowledge, it's easy to demonstrate in the proposal. You understand how those things are intertwined with each other. And instead, a good editor will make sure to send it to books to people who can review it, who are experts to, and not trying to destroy the book, but really to help you. I mean, I think good reviews are there to peer review process is really important because it really helps enormously reshaping the book, bringing things out that you might not see because you're very deep in the proposal and you're not thinking about maybe the entire project, you know, it's from a bit of a distance. So that's really, really important, I think, to realize that the reviews are not there to, you know, we all, of course, take criticism in different ways. But the criticism is designed to make the book better, not to say you're stupid or you know. And a good editor will be able to see where like there's certain kind of maybe, you know, personal vendettas going on. You might not, of course, they're anonymous. You don't know who these reviewers are, but it might be someone who knows you and doesn't like the work you do or is ideologically opposed to it. And so good editors will be able to see that. So that's really important to know that like the editing process, that the review process, both at the proposal and manuscript stage is really there to help you. I've had in the manuscript stage immensely helpful reviews from, and as Noah said, you know, and you're not going to agree with everything. You can also say like, I disagree completely with this comment because this book is doing something else, you know, or this part of this book is doing this or that, and this reviewer doesn't see that. So that's important. It's not just simply to take the review blindly, but to really look at it because you have to kind of process the review and say, all right, what is actually legitimate here, and which is something I can't do because I don't have the time, because of course we have finite time in terms of books. And that's the good thing also about, at least my experience with MIT, is that like the process is very, very clear. When you do journal writing, like I'm editing a journal now, it takes forever. You constantly have to go with the editors of the journal. As if you're a special editor, then you have to send things out, then you have to take them back, then you have to rewrite, it takes forever. Books are much easier, at least with MIT, are much easier because there's a very clear process. And once the book, we could probably talk about this as well. When book goes into production, you have really hardcore deadlines you have to stick with because the press is dependent on you because they have to reserve the presses like a year ahead of time. It's a really long process. And there's maybe something we could talk about a little bit later. The fact that book publishing is really transforming because in the past, you know, scholars would write a book on a piece of research they did for 5 or 10 years. Now, you know, COVID's a good example. Like suddenly out of nowhere, this happens and you want to respond, but the book editing process is long. It takes really basically 5 years for a single authored manuscript to get from idea to on the shelf. And that includes the writing, that includes the review process, that includes all the production apparatus and everything. So how do you respond to technological topics, for instance, artificial intelligence, extended reality, these things that are coming and that are changing day by day. So you have to always take the long view and go, okay, how do I deal with this question? I think we should talk about that a little bit later about like this real shift in in the urgency of certain kinds of topics, particularly within techno-political culture, and how we deal now with a publishing system which is still set up for traditional kind of understandings of timelines and timeframes.
Yeah, I think I'm happy to hear you say, Chris, just that this discussion is very much about that phase of preparation of a manuscript. So I think a surprise for some young scholars might be how many editors or how many kind of styles of editing end up being applied to your project. So just in terms of those phases of a project, during that first preparation of the manuscript, you might have this interaction with an acquisitions editor who might help you to, tailor the structure of your argument. There might be some substantive conversation around the editing of your manuscript, even before you're in the peer review process. Then your acquisitions editor will, as Noah said, help you navigate that peer review process and formulate your feedback and your revisions. Then those revisions will be looked at again. And then when you are in the production workflow with a managing editor, there most likely will be another editor that's a copy editor that will get involved, that will be really looking at, again, some of the larger points, but also looking at the style, the house style, most likely Chicago manual, very fine-tuning editing. So I wanted to jump in there with I know for me, it was kind of mind-blowing how many editors it takes to bring a process forward through the many stages. Mm-hmm. Not to mention proofreaders, and that's like a whole other editor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. I'm going to jump onto something that both you and Chris mentioned regarding the proposal. Before even editing, what is it that you bring to a proposal? Like, how much should you have ready, and what do you arrive with in the first? It wouldn't even be a first draft, but just a proposal for a book. Like, how much is enough, and how much is too much? Maybe for Noah and Meredith, since you receive proposals.
Yeah, I would say, I'd like to see at least 2 sample chapters in addition to the proposal itself. And the proposals can be fairly robust. A solid proposal is 10 pages to 15 pages, sort of. Have an annotated table of contents included. So I can get a solid idea of what the structure looks like for the book, and kind of what the frames that you are setting up are in the book. And then to get a sample of what your actual voice sounds like in the chapters. So that's really what I want. Too much, I don't know if there's too much, really. I think some people, again, as I said earlier, I like to receive a proposal, but I would never reject a manuscript because it's already written. I would want to see some things about audience, but too much isn't necessarily a thing. Somebody might disagree with me on that one, but to my mind, the more I have, the more I can consider. But also, I can't help you shape it quite as well if you already have the manuscript down. But if you know what you're writing and you're like, this is a book, especially people have written 2 or 3 books for me before, they might just send a manuscript or like, I wrote this. What do you think? But if you send me something shorter that you already have drafted, I can have more input and help you guide you a little more clearly than with a full manuscript.
Mm-hmm. Maybe adding on for that, Concordia University Press, obviously being a much younger press, we're in a more flexible state in terms of how we deal with authors. And some of the books that are forthcoming now came out of conversations we had at humanities conferences when we were there with a booth with no books, and people were coming up and saying, like, who are you people in this booth? And we had some really interesting conversations just about what people were working on. And then those were, followed up with, more of an informal letter that wasn't really even at a proposal stage. And then, a year later, maybe something that came out as a proposal, or talking to a young scholar about their dissertation. And then some years later, they're ready to revisit that research and to think about it in a way that's not a dissertation, but that is a book, which is like a whole other step of looking back through your research, finding those holes, and then addressing methodology questions from a different angle. So I think much as Chris was saying of his conversation with MIT, that there was like a a conversation about a gap in the knowledge, and then that sparks an idea, and then that ends up following up in a different way. So sometimes the process can be less linear, but I would definitely advise, if you are going a more linear route and you are working on a proposal, ask anyone you know that has done a successful proposal, because much like all the proposals we do for all of the funding and for everything else, there are conventions, there are section headers, there are, I think it's come up a couple of times, what is the gap in the literature? Where do you fit? Really look at the press itself. And as was mentioned, look at your own bookshelf. What are you reading? How does your project fit into what the press is doing? We sometimes receive like form submissions where it's really clear that people don't know who we are. They don't know that we're looking at, interdisciplinary publishing. They don't know that where our focus is. And they maybe think we're like this other Concordia University in the US, which has a different focus altogether. But so really know like where you're submitting, and take time to tailor that and to look at other models, I would say, be my 2 cents.
I would just quickly add on to that a little bit and just say, in my first proposals, I tended to overwrite them because I hadn't had as much scholarly writing. And so I had very long literature surveys. So I wanted to prove that I really knew the fields I was talking about, again, because it was interdisciplinary work. On my second book, it was cutting between science and technology studies, performance studies, digital media, and anthropology. So that was I had to have a very large kind of literature survey because I was dealing with so many fields and trying to point out the gaps in those specific fields, and then the gap at the intersection of those fields. A proposal is kind of, then of course, as I've written more, it's gotten more streamlined, but a proposal is kind of a mix between a pitch. It's not the pitching, not only the editor, because you've talked to the editor and the editor is interested in seeing the proposal, but also pitching to the potential readers who are the peer reviewers, but also, and then it's like also in many ways like a grant proposal. Different writing, obviously, because the grant proposal is much more kind of mechanical. But you have to cover similar things. You have to, like in the grant proposal, what's the contribution? So you still want to say what's the contribution of this book to a body of existing knowledge, and what's new about it. You have to cover the literature, right? Where are the gaps? You have to cover sometimes method, because you may have a very interesting method that's a key part of the book. We tend not to think that books have anything to do with method, but actually they do. I just read a huge book from colleague Georgina Bourne. It's 900 pages on music and digitization, and the methods, which were comparative ethnography, were critical to understanding the structure of the book. You have to point out the competition. That's really key. You have to know the field, and that's different than literature, because literature is really like positioning the problematic of the project. The competition is who's written books that are, you could say, oh, that's very close to me, and why is it different than those things? And also, and as no one said, you want to demonstrate like, what could the potential impact be of this book, and again, like books have different audiences. My book Entangled, curators read it, and producers read it, and art historians read it, and dancers read it. It's a really wide mix of things, and other books are much more niche in terms of their audiences. So you just have to say, like, you don't be too shy about who you think the audience would be. You say, I'd like to reach these people, but I don't know them because they're not in my area of expertise. But also don't be too broad and say everybody, because there's different peer groups, that you could be writing toward.
Thank you. Let's see if any folks in the room have any questions for our guests. Wait.
Here.
We have a microphone as well on our microphone.
I'll bring the microphone to
bien de
Maurice.
As someone doing their PhD and thinking about like hopefully publishing that PhD thesis as a book or like in book form, first, what is a good timeline for like starting to pitch that idea? And second, I also understood, or like from previous conversations, that for book publishing, it's also of interest that it's new material. So you cannot really like publish your PhD as a book, but it has to add something that maybe was not the focus of your PhD. And maybe there's like some insights that you can give on that.
Thank you. I don't know who wants to address that very pertinent question.
I can start again, if that's okay. Just in terms of timeline, especially at conferences. I haven't been to conferences in a couple of years because of COVID. I miss talking to people about really early stages, what their PhD is on, and that, again, as Meredith was saying, that's a seed that germinates then for an extended period of time. I might not hear back from somebody for a few years, but then suddenly, boom, there it is. So I would say it's never too early to start talking. I would say it could be too early to start actually setting in a proposal. So I would finish the PhD, and the main reason is there's different audiences. I think this goes to your second question. Your PhD is for 5 people on your committee. That's what the PhD is for. And even if your book is for a very narrow focused window of academics and professional scholars, that still is wider than 5 people. And so you really need to think about it. There's a restructuring that happens when you transition a book from a PhD to a book. Chris mentioned that method is part of the book, but also you don't want a chapter on method. Right. That gets dull, and you could move some of that. You could spread that across chapters a little bit, talk about it. You could put a little bit in your introduction. You could have an appendix that has more details on the specific method, but you wouldn't want, you wouldn't want a chapter on a lit review either, where you have to have that in your PhD. You want to be able to embed that into the book in a more reasonable manner, sort of, so that it does have that wider appeal. And so that's what I would say, is just think about the 2 different audiences, and that's an important factor, where it's 5 people versus even 300 people, but that is a factor of however many. That would be my number one suggestion on that front.
Yeah, and I would just also kind of second that and say that also dissertations, there's 2 things. One is a dissertation is a particular kind of writing, which is rather pedantic in some ways, where you have to basically say, like, in this dissertation, I will argue blah, 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 blah. I will use these methods, X, Y, and Z, da, 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 da. When you write a book, you're, even though, again, you're maybe appealing to a small audience, you have a different style. It's, as Noah said, it's an integration through. So there's a different kind of signposting you have to do. You don't have to have this dissertation-like language. And I think that's also important to understand too, that, like, I think younger, especially people writing PhDs and emerging scholars, have this assumption that there's a specific academic way of writing. If you look at the books, and of course, first books are different than books later, but if you look at a range of books from anthropologists, sociologists, digital media scholars, game scholars, and so, you're going to find really quite different ways of writing. Of course, everyone's trying to make an argument, but people make arguments in different ways. So don't feel that, like, there's this academic way, which usually turns out to be very dry and pedantic. You want the book to feel, as I said earlier, like stories, like that's something that's really exciting, that and you have to, of course, be precise and concise. But this idea that there is some desired academic style is somewhat of a myth. In fact, the books that are very academic in style are hard to read now. In fact, and of course, it depends on who you're writing for. But
je suis vraiment d'accord avec ce qu'il écrit. C'est très important dans ce passage entre, effectivement, il y a 2 choses. D'un côté, il faut quelque part dépasser ce mythe de l'écriture académique, je dirais même plus de l'écriture objective, c'est-à-dire que je pense que les problèmes, c'est la soi-disant objectivité, c'est-à-dire les penser que existe une objectivité. L'objectivité, c'est une fiction comme les autres, mais avec les risques d'être plus dangereuse parce qu'elle impose une certaine autorité. Donc je pense qu'au contraire, il faut assumer d'être situé, d'être subjectif et de construire un véritable positionnement dans un domaine, qui est un positionnement aussi singulier, mais aussi culturel. Donc, on a un domaine en face de nous qu'on veut transformer, modifier par notre proposition théorique. C'est exactement ça, la théorie. Hein. C'est très important nous, Chris, qu'on travaille beaucoup entre art et design. Très souvent, on nous critique en disant, voilà, il y a une distinction trop nette entre la théorie et la pratique. Bah, la théorie, c'est tout simplement construire un positionnement. Donc, c'est vraiment ça, quoi. Donc, et donc, je pense que cette question aussi de changer de style, il me semble extrêmement important. Alors, dans les livres écrits, les Américains sont très bons pour ça. MIT Press, ils sont très bons pour ça aussi. Très souvent, les chapitres commencent par un pitch presque littéraire. Enfin, on raconte une histoire. Hein, on raconte une histoire. À 1954, tel, il est allé là-bas, il a fait ci, il a fait ça. Et donc, et après, il y a les raisonnements qui commencent. Mais déjà, on a séduit les lecteurs. Alors que effectivement, Noah l'a dit très justement, très souvent, on a dans l'écriture académique, quelque chose de pédant. Oui, tu l'as dit aussi, Chris. Donc voilà, je pense que ça, ce sont des petites ruses, mais qu'il faut appliquer absolument, quoi, et qui fonctionnent.
I would just say one other quick thing about the dissertation versus the book. Occasionally, I have had students, PhD students who are older, whose I encourage them to write the dissertation more like they were writing a book. Obviously, that doesn't mean that the book is done.
Oh no, it's done. That was very important.
If you can hear us, Chris, you've frozen. Oh. Maybe it's us.
Like he would be doing.
Oh,
what?
Chris, you just froze on our end for a minute. So just.
Oh, sorry.
I think we lost you at the word done.
Done. Now I have a student who's working on a dissertation right now, and I'm encouraging him to write it much more as if it would be in the style of a manuscript. That then, of course, it'll need different kind of work as opposed to that kind of changing of language and shifting away from the state where you have to prove something to 5 people on the committee versus to write a general, writing for a broader peer-reviewed audience. So sometimes that is the case, that someone who's perhaps a more mature scholar or is more facilitative writing the dissertation itself kind of gets away from that. There's a literature chapter, there's a method chapter, and gets already more integrated in the flow and the style of the book, which would help also potentially the editor to see, okay, the book is, that there's a step that's been taken care of, and then they can get on to actually the other steps that are necessary.
I think this is a really good point for research creation folks, because we really don't have to follow a certain structure, I think. So thinking about this at the beginning of the process could be really helpful, and in the proposal process and discussing with the advisors and other folks who can help think through from the beginning what would make this a more legible and interesting and potentially for a book down the road. Why not? That sounds really good. Following up on that, in terms of a voice, a lot of times there's co-authored articles possible. And when writing with co-authors, one of our questions we were wondering about is if anyone has advice on giving a unified voice to a manuscript or a piece of writing, because that can be a challenge, and yet co-writing can be great for helping move things along and having maybe not feeling so alone in the process. And I know Meredith has, often works with a partner. So maybe I'll turn to you first, Meredith, and we can talk a bit about co-authorship.
So kind of switching out of my press role into my art practice role. I've been working with an artist collaborator for 18 years, and we work together under the name Leisure. And we have developed over that period of time a shared voice. We are currently in our 3rd week of the Indie PhD program as a collaborative duo, and it's blowing our minds. Again, we're figuring out a lot of the things you've addressed. Because we have a very integrated voice, how do we navigate an academic situation where we've been accepted as a duo for a research creation project, but we will be writing dissertations with separate voices. So it's been, I don't think I can comment it necessarily in a particularly helpful way because I'm really in the weeds with it at the moment. But it's been interesting to try and find what that voice feels like. In other situations, like an edited compendium that professionally I've worked with at the press, it's interesting how co-editors or editors can work with various chapters to try and find a cohesive idea so that you don't end up with a book that just feels like a collage, but can feel like a collage in the best sense, where something new comes from a group of parts put together. I think I'll point to one thing that was on the list. I think indexes are a magical tool, especially when you're really working with multiple authors in one book. When editors work on that index themselves rather than hiring an indexer, because most likely as an author, you will be responsible for the indexing of your book. The press will not be responsible for that part of the process. But working as the editor through that indexing is an amazing moment of looking at what those through lines are through all of the author's texts. What kind of categories, subcategories, places, things are being referred to over and over again. So I think somehow keeping the index in mind early in the process can help when you're giving feedback to individual authors in a co-authored volume. So two different perspectives on co-authorship.
It's very, very, very useful, namely for us here at Hexagram when we're trying to work with several different voices. And I think, Emanuele, toi aussi, je pense, tu as beaucoup d'expérience sur des volumes édités avec plusieurs voix. Je pense à Objet à comportement, par exemple. Quelle est ton expérience à chercher une homogénéité ou une ligne conductrice dans la voix parmi les différents auteurs?
Alors, je pense qu'il y a deux typologies d'écriture commune différentes. Donc, il y a des articles qu'on écrit à plusieurs et dans lesquels ça m'arrivait aussi, notamment avec mon collègue que tu connais bien, Manuel Samuel Bianchini. On a signé plusieurs articles pour des catalogues, pour des reviews, pour des magazines ou même pour des chapitres d'ouvrages, des textes dans lesquels nos voix fondent et produisent une seule voix, deviennent une seule voix, souvent donc autour d'un thème. Donc là, un peu comme Meredith l'a expliqué, c'est vraiment une sorte de complicité qui se construit dans les années et qui fait que finalement, on sait que on est complémentaires sur certains aspects. Donc moi, je suis plutôt sur les côtés historiques, Samuel plus sur les côtés techniques, et donc on partage donc les mêmes textes en touchant du coup des éléments différents. Après, il y a l'ouvrage collectif, donc dans lequel effectivement, comme je disais tout à l'heure, moi il me semble important de garder une tension polyphonique, d'avoir vraiment des voix différentes. C'est ça l'intérêt d'un livre de ce type, c'est-à-dire de rassembler comme une constellation plusieurs voix différentes autour d'une thématique, ce qui permet justement de ne pas unifier les voix, mais de garder cette dialectique. Par contre, il y a une chose qui est extrêmement importante, c'est que tout en gardant la différence des voix, la différence des positions, parfois on a besoin de faire un vrai travail de mise aux normes, donc pour qu'il n'y ait pas une hétérogénéité excessive qui du coup produit quelque chose de trop divergent entre les méthodes, plus que sur les contenus. Et alors là, effectivement, il y a un vrai travail à faire pour que, disons que les différentes voix se situent au même endroit et convergent quelque part, tout en gardant bien vivante cette tension.
I would just add one thing two things. One is about the question of indexing. I've done the indexing myself for all three of my books. First of all, you have very little time to do it, usually 2 to 3 weeks. which is very difficult to hand off to somebody else to do. I don't know if Noah has encountered yet any kind of AI program systems that can do indexing. Probably not. The problem is because indexing is contextual. So it doesn't matter how many times a word is repeated in a book. Only you, who's the author, knows where to put emphasis on which words are important, which ones are not. Now, we could probably train some transformer neural network to probabilistically look at what will come next in a series of sentence structures, but even there, it's not. It could be it would be showing and all the time, in the algorithm. But indexing is something that's time consuming, but it's essential. It's very, very necessary because it's the way that people, and you have to think about what are the different readers and how do those different readers, what would they want to know about a particular person or a particular idea or something. So indexing should not be taken lightly. And it's also something that you can't just, especially if there are researchers in the room, you can't just farm off to a graduate student, because it's actually, unless that student knows the book as well as you do, and I've never encountered a student that knows my books, better than I. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to quickly say, and probably we'll come into this in the discussion, is I always tell this to my colleagues in Montreal and my students, that the idea of research creation, let's say, is a bubble in Canada, and especially in Quebec. Having sat on short juries, everyone knows that Quebec is way ahead than the rest of Canada in this kind of thinking. What I would say is that if you're doing a first book, and maybe Noah can talk to this as well, unless you, let's say, you have the experience and the facility to weave together both a, let's say, academic, critical kind of writing with a poetic kind of writing, which is extremely difficult. You have to be careful. So what I would encourage people to do, not to discourage people, but to know that the majority of peer reviewers that are academic peer reviewers that are outside of Canada, who are outside of the Quebec research creation bubble, may not understand this, but not just stylistically, but let's say ontologically, how you're trying to write and position something, moving between different styles and forms of writing and this and that. And most first books are more conservative in the sense that, it's a first book. You want to try to get your ideas in a manuscript format, a monograph format. So I would definitely encourage people to, if research creation becomes a kind of modus operandi for writing, is to in the proposal to talk about that, to talk about why that is necessary over another kind of maybe more expository style, or more traditional style, and then to demonstrate the kinds of books and that kind of follow the form that you're trying to pursue, and also why that's necessary. Because it's not that an editor will reject that flat off. It's just that you have to remember that the kind of language that we use in Quebec is not necessarily, especially also in Europe, as Emanuele can say, is that artistic research as a concept in Europe is much less rigorously thought through than the discussions in Canada about it. So you tend to get much more, classic artist statement kind of, or like some editors might call it vanity books, vanity manuscripts that are not as critical or academic as you can imagine. So it's something just to think about. Maybe we'll get into that discussion, but just to remember that this is not a known concept. Practice-based research is more known, but again, there's different ways that those kinds of, most practice-based research projects do not yield publishable manuscripts. Which is important to know. So you have to do extra work in justifying why a particular form and give examples that are similar to what you want to do.
follow up on
Thanks,
that quickly, if I may. I just to the practice-based research points back to a point about suggesting reviewers to the editor, because if you were to send me a practice-based research and I set it out to just kind of my networks, yeah, there might be a problem there. But if you're able to suggest, hey, I really want to see some reviewers from this field, from this methodology, from the practice-based research community, I won't necessarily just reach out to whoever you send me, but I can use them to start triangulating sort of the right people to find. So I heavily advocate for, especially if you're coming with interdisciplinarity, new methods, anything along those lines, suggesting the reviewers for me to look into and to use them as kind of to network out, a highly important process for sure.
One other comment, I think Emanuele mentioned this earlier on, that also looking at which publisher you're working with. I think you mentioned Sternberg, which is a very interesting option for maybe less traditional publishing. Hatche would be another one that would be someone to look at. So again, like go to your own bookshelves and look at what the publishers are that you're reading, or attend some of the artist publishing fairs. This weekend in Montreal, we have an amazing art book fair that would be well worth visiting to see who the publishers are that are here. As if peer review is not necessarily something that's essential to your process, then you can work with also gallery publishers or other university-based publications that might have a different way of attacking your manuscript.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you. Were there any more questions in the room? Avez-vous des questions pour nos... Not at this moment.
I may have a question.
Yep. Just go for it.
It's about the, you were just saying, Chris, about not every practice-based research, as we understand it here in Quebec, research creation yields immediately very publishable manuscripts or books. And how about taking a stance or taking a voice or choosing a voice out of that research? And I think you've done that quite recently. For example, there's a strong difference between your book Entangled and Sensing Machines, where it really comes from research, but you give it a voice that is much wider, broader public. So what was the process in writing that book as opposed to the previous ones? And what tips can you give about broadening your public and making it more approachable?
I mean, that's a great question. And in fact, each of the books I've done with MIT had a different style, partly because I felt that the form and forms and the voice that I was trying to use was endogenous to the material I was trying to deal with. So for instance, in Alien Agency, I was addressing questions of reflexivity and anthropology and STS, and trying to understand what that means within artistic context, in the lab, just like Bruno Latour did with laboratory life. And so I took on a lot of different models and then tried to understand how to weave those things together. Sensing Machines was different in the sense that when Doug Seri and it would be something that Noah and I would also talk about in the future, is like Doug wanted me to write more of a trade book because MIT, there's a difference. So I think it's important to point out that this difference between like academic trade, like professional and trade. Trade has different meanings. Big presses like Random House or Hachette or whatever are writing kind of books for huge audiences or selling books to huge audiences. But what's happened in the academic press context is that a lot of those presses, for instance, like Penguin, which then was bought out by Random House, and they used to be presses that would do more risky books. They would do more popular science kinds of books and stuff. More recently, those presses are just like, looking for huge mega sellers. So consequently, the big academic presses in the United States, MIT, Harvard, Chicago, Duke, to a lesser degree, have adopted certain kinds of books that are appeal to a broader audience. Basically, it doesn't mean that they're dumbed down. It just means that they're written in a style that can appeal to broader publics. So it was very conscious choice to write sensing machines, because it's an issue that's very important right now, sensing in everyday life, and to write it in a way that it would be still academically rigorous, but it didn't have, for instance, it had only footnotes. It had no in-text citations, because that, of course, is a particular academic style that might turn off a reader. Or, for instance, you can't assume that the reader in a trade book knows who Foucault is. You have to say the historian and social theorist Michel Foucault, who spent many years studying how blah blah. You have to not assume that the reader knows, unlike a very specific peer group, knows the references you're talking about. And in that way, it's an interesting challenge, because you have to, it would be like explaining ideas to your parents, or to your friends who would be interested, but don't necessarily, possess the kind of knowledge you do. And so that was a very conscious choice to write that book in the way it is, which is in very short chapters. I'm in fact right now in Georgina Bourne's new book. Some of the chapters are 70, 80 pages. It's just very long. I mean, I can't read 70 pages. It's like a really long chapter. And it's because it's coming from a big research project. And, there are PhDs and postdocs that wrote these chapters. And so they're quite long. They have very long arguments. But Sensing Machines was short chapters, and that worked really well, because it helped. And I threw out a huge amount of stuff. I threw out 200 pages I had written, because it just didn't fit, It'll go into another book somehow. So I think the process of that book was, and it was difficult, because you have to go kind of constantly question, does that make sense? And I gave it to people to read, who didn't know the area, didn't have academic backgrounds. I gave it to artists. I gave it to technologists. Engineers are good examples of people I gave it to, who don't have any critical, sociological, anthropological, digital media studies vocabulary, to see if they understood it. So that was a very conscious choice to write the book for that broader audience, and that way, it also MIT has pushed it more as a trade publication, and that's because I've written other books, and I had a sense of how to write it. But in fact, it was interesting in the peer review, the first peer reviews, when I turned in the manuscript, there was this tension going between like the people who wanted yes, it's a really exciting book, but it should be much more in depth and just study about this, and this, and then the people said, if this is going to be a trade book, then it has to be, it has to be broader in its appeal, and I said. And I responded to the reviewers by saying, I want to do that trade book. So therefore I'm going to do this. And that's how I rewrote the book quite dramatically, in fact, based on those reviews. Because I said, okay, the reviewers are identifying this tension, but I want to follow this part of that. So anyway, it was a very different process, and not at all easy, but also rewarding, because I think also for me writing books, because I'm also making huge artworks all the time, it's a chance also to work out things that the work inspired that I could never do in the artwork, and so then the book becomes a new kind of vehicle to think through those issues. And I would never, ever say to my social science colleagues or humanities colleagues that the book is the equivalent, like the artwork is the equivalent of a book. It's a very, very different thing, they do different things. So yeah, anyway, that's my experience on that like each of the topics of the books I've written demand particular approaches, stylistic, intellectual, historical, to get the point across that I was trying to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, questions? I have a bit of a two-part question about what to expect. So at the beginning of the process, what a contract might look like, or what kinds of considerations a contract for a book might include. And then at the end of the process, what could one expect? Is there any money? Do I get copies of the book? And that kind of thing. So I guess maybe we could start with either Noah or Meredith.
Meredith, do you want to take first start?
Yeah, sure. I can jump in. I was thinking of this also as Chris was talking about expectations of trade versus scholarly, and then scholarly that's trade. So there are all these different expectations, I think. Like if you Google how much will I make from a book, which I did today, like thinking about this question. And I think there is this impression that with a trade book, you would get, like a 50% royalty. And that's really not what we're seeing in our contracts at this point. Is much like slimmer royalty.
Dream on.
Yeah, like tiny royalty percentages on tiny amounts of sales. So I think if you're hoping to retire from your scholarly book, like that's not
unless you're Judith Butler, who sold 500,000 copies of Gender Trouble, or Harari, who's a million copies of whatever Homo sapiens.
But in terms of the contract, you will see a lot of your expectations should be laid out really clearly, and if they're not, you should ask questions. So we spoke about how you should, as the author, will most likely be responsible for your indexing. Also, you'll most likely be responsible for your rights clearances, for your images, for providing high-res images with captions. Chris, I have no idea how you ever do it with yours. You must have like an amazing spreadsheet system. But think about that early, that the images that you're choosing, you will be responsible for clearing, and you'll need to have the budget in place for those clearances, except for very unusual situations. And Noah, please correct me if I'm wrong there. And press to press, I think your expectations after the launch of the book might be quite different. Some publishers have resources in terms of promotions, distribution, book launches. That's something you should talk about with your acquisitions editor. A lot of times with our authors, they're really proactive in terms of how they're promoting those books. Alex Ketchum is like amazing. She's doing signings that are her own initiative. She has blogs. She has people talking to her all the time. So that handbook is selling really quickly, and also has become a candidate for course adoption, which is a big plus in terms of the sales of books. Of course, I'm speaking from an open access press perspective. So all of our books are available in their entirety for free on an EPUB reader. So the purchase situation is a little bit different for an open access press. In terms of copies, that I think that's determined press by press in different ways. Of course, we provide copies of the book to our authors. Our acquisitions editor, I think, bicycled the copies to Alex Ketchum like as soon as we got them. But we're new and keen in our aftercare with our authors, and we have our distribution partnership is with UBC. So our fulfillment also happens through UBC's sub-agreement with University of Toronto. So in Canada, distribution is happening through their promotions channels as well as our own. So they're the ones that are doing the big meetings with the book reps like Indigo, or making sure that books get placed with larger bookstores. Chicago manages our distribution in the US. So that's like another set of agreements, but the author agreement is with Concordia University Press, and the intellectual property stays with the author. So that's part of how we structure those agreements, like in broad strokes.
Can I just ask Noah, actually, this is something useful, I think, for everyone to know about MIT's position. And people are very confused about what open access means, MIT's position on open access, because one of the problems which is occurring, as you know, is that increasingly grant-making bodies, Switzerland's a good example, the SNF, the Swiss National Science Foundation, but also increasingly in Quebec, for instance, are demanding that books that are funded by research grants be published as open access. And so this is a really interesting set of complexities for book publishing. And I'm curious your position on that, both your MIT's position on that, because I know there have been some books that have been published open access, and some you have to buy open access rights in journals, for instance. Journals are a slightly different issue, but anyway, this is something I think would be useful for everyone to know.
Yeah, sure. Meredith was correct on all of the things about the contract, so.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump over that, but
no.
Open
I
access
think open access is really important. So at MIT Press, we're not unlike Concordia, we're not a fully open access press, but we, as Chris is saying, there's various new funding mechanisms that require open access, and we're working on how to do this. So traditionally, the main way that open access publications were funded were author funding. So authors would bring money through research grants or through whatever mechanisms they could to help supply the funds to help offset basically some of the production costs for the book to make them open access. At the MIT Press, we generally say rule of thumb is about $15,000 for that. However, this is inequitable to say the least. People coming from less funded institutions are unable to publish their research open access then if we require this funding. So we have been working on methods to promote open access books. And one of the big things that are, so this is I'd say hobby horse, but it's more of this is a passion, I would say, of our director. She's really looking to publish open access books at the press. And she founded, so this spring was the first catalog of what's called direct to open. And so this then comes back to a couple points we've already been talking about, the difference between trade and professional scholarly books. All of our professional scholarly monographs are entered into this program and are published open access without funds from the authors themselves. The funding, in turn, is coming through libraries. And so the libraries we have several people now who are in charge of approaching libraries and having the libraries sign up for the open access fund, which gives them access to our back catalog of book titles, as well as helping in their mission. Many libraries have an additional mission to support open access publishing. And so they help us, they supply us with some amount of funds, I'm not sure exactly how much, to help us offset opening up our entire front list of professional monographs. And so I think in something like we publish about 300 books a year, give or take. And something like 100 or so were published open access. I think this year it's around that range. I don't have the exact numbers. Through this direct to open platform publishing. And so this is really one of the ways we're trying to figure out, because it fundamentally is a question about funding, and how can we, because, we do have certain metrics that we have to keep up with in terms of, the MIT, I call it MIT corporate, checks in on us about how we're doing financially. And so, when we have big trade books, those generally, unless the author can supply some funding themselves, those generally won't be part of the direct to open program. Those and there is a different sort of, as Meredith was alluding to the treatment these books will get in the latter life. Once it's gone through productions in print, trade books get kind of publicity tours that you might get more, you'll get a little more attention sort of for marketing publicity, as opposed to a professional book, which will get more specific attention towards that audience is directed towards. So, a professional book, although it might happen, but wouldn't necessarily be pitched to New York Times for op-eds, something like that. And so to go back to open access, those kind of big trade books are not open access. But one of our next things that we're working on, and this is a third type of book that people forget about sometimes, but actually is the book that keeps the lights on, textbooks. And producing open access textbooks is kind of the next hurdle of how to make that work. And we've had success so far. We have a book from our computer science list, our deep learning book by Yoshua Bengio and co-authors, is open access, but has also been a huge seller for us, and just gigantic. The book that really keeps our lights on is the Introduction to Algorithms by Corman, which just released its 4th edition this year. And that is really fundamentally the kind of groundwork on which we're able to build up our professional scholarly monographs and our trade catalogs, is having that kind of core of textbooks that go through. But often it's we're working out how to best make those texts open as well, because they do get expensive, and that then is prohibitive as well. But open access is something that we're working on, kind of how to restructure the idea of how to kind of publish with that in mind. And it's great to see things like Concordia University Press. There's a handful of other, Lever Press, University of Amherst Press, I think. Punctum Press is one that's a little more afield. It's like does classics and stuff. But this is something that small kind of upstart presses are able to do a little more effectively than something that's already kind of been established, but still something that we're definitely pursuing in a serious and I think a pretty effective manner, all things considered.
Okay.
Yeah, we're just about done. Let's see the time.
There's no
7:15.
from
Yeah.
the audience.
D'autres questions? Okay. Yeah, super informative. Merci beaucoup à nos présenteurs, nos speakers, nos intervenants. Thank you all so much for joining us. I learned a lot. And any final thoughts as we close?
I'd like to thank, of course, Meredith and Noah, Chris, Emanuele, for it's late for you too, especially Chris and Emanuele. Thank you so much for staying up to have this discussion with us. You guys are far
Merci
into
à vous.
your
Yeah, merci beaucoup, and thanks to everybody for being present, and good night.
Yeah.
good
Okay.
night. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
It's been great.
Ciao.